Hello world of YouTube and welcome to the listening log update for June of 2023. I've got newer releases that I spun over the last month that I'm going to be talking about with time codes listed in the description for each album. If you'd like to skip across this video, leave it a like if you're excited, and let's go ahead and get started.
Searching for some benefits for perfect attendance, keep attention span attentive like we dance.
Now the first album I actually decided to talk about this month was one that sort of bled in from last month because it was a bit of a meteor project. It seemingly had a lot more going on, at least conceptually, that I wanted to sort of sit with and stew with and see how it sat with me, because I appreciate a lot of what Slug and Ann have been doing throughout the 2010s, especially with their sort of picking a sort of sonic tapestry and seeing what they can bring out of it. While that sort of faded away on their last album, Word, I think that this newest one, So Many Other Realities Exist Simultaneously, feels like it's trying to sort of coalesce all of those ideas into a meteor project that is the longest that they've dropped in a while, and has these sort of ideas of exploring the apocalyptic feeling world that we've been living in the last couple of years, but trying to find ways to cut some optimism amidst all of that dread and doom scrolling and darkness, while not losing the honesty of what Slug has been going through probably throughout pockets of the last couple of years. And that sort of coalescence of those pocket singular ideas more comes in the instrumental palette, but I think that the two of them's chemistry at keeping true to those ideas while finding a way to meld them under this umbrella isn't entirely lost. You know, the album is sort of structured in a way that it has this meteor track with these other smaller tracks sprinkled around them to enhance those ideas. A la where, like, In My Head and Crop Circles sort of kind of feels Mi Vida Local-ish. It's dark, but not quite as dark as The Day Before Halloween, whereas It Happened Last Morning and Thanxiety more lean into that. I can see Still Life and After Tears sort of ending up on Wherever, and I can appreciate a lot at finding ways to meld these different concepts or sonic tapestries into a cohesive project. I think the one longer track that I could really do without especially is Talk Talk. I like the 80s groove of that track. I just also think it kind of sticks out like a sore thumb on this project for a moment where the group really sort of goes off the rails in a way that I don't think works at all. My biggest issue with this record more comes from its length. I appreciate the moments where they explore these ideas in lengthier sections, like Sculpting with Fire. I really love September Fool's Day. It feels like a true rocket of hopeful horizons amidst the dark pocket of the record that it's in. And I can appreciate the interlude track Positive Space for trying to do the same thing, but that's sort of a great example of both. And I like some of the interlude driven tracks, don't get me wrong, but I feel like there's just a bit too many of them amidst this over an hour in length project. You know, while I like that this album is meant to feel like a real scope of how big and broad and diverse the universe can be, and how there's still darkness amidst any corner of the world that you decide to explore through, and again, trying to find the optimism amidst that, it's just a point where it feels like it's sort of running in circles as the album sort of goes on. And that's been my biggest takeaway with this every time I sit down with it. I enjoy a decent chunk of this record. It just feels like, for the first time in a while, like it's got a bit too much, and could easily have some stuff stripped away to keep the pacing a little more concise. While, again, I like the ambition, and I can appreciate tracks like the storytelling on Sterling and Eventide, or the internal dialogue that can sort of happen on a track like In My Head. It's just all a bit too much. It's still really solid. I appreciate these two a lot, and I think that they've still dropped a hell of a banger on here. It's just an album that needs a little bit more of a doll up, in my opinion. I'm still giving it a 7. I still think it's incredibly strong, and I again, appreciate Slug's ability to sort of weave these really good rhymes and retaining to these thematics of trying to strive amidst your own personal qualms and the chaotic-ass world that the world has become, but could have done a little less, in my opinion. You know, in the wake of the passing of Taylor Hawkins, I wasn't sure what the future for Foo Fighters was going to look like. Not to say that the band hasn't had this sort of revolving door lineup in the past, but the band's never felt lost quite to that scale before. And on top of that, Dave also lost his mom after Taylor's passing, so it's clear that, like, internally, the band, but especially Dave, has been going through a lot of grief. And through all of that negativity that could stem from those emotions, the band on But Here We Are has found a way to push through that and use those thematics to pivot into some optimistic horizons by the end of the album's runtime in a way that I think is not only admirable, but also sonically acts as a testament to the band being able to unify under those circumstances in a way that surpasses a lot of where the band had been creatively channeling over the last 10 years, in my opinion. But Here We Are is a very strong outing that bucks a lot of the traditions that the band had been putting forth on a lot of their releases, but is front to back just a constant bevy of well-constructed rock jams. Tapping into that grief sees them talking about feeling under the pressure of it, like on Under You, and getting past that, and having these sort of glimpses of memories, like on Hearing Voices and The Glass, looking sort of at yourself before and after such intense trauma. Same with The Teacher, a 10-minute penultimate jam that really puts a lot of that pain in the forefront in the sort of internal struggle to push past that and move on. A sentiment that I definitely know very strongly and can appreciate the band so eloquently and accurately putting those emotions on display and that internal struggle on display. The bittersweet feeling that happens as time passes without somebody and you feel them sort of in a metaphysical sense leaving the earth behind more and more as each day passes. The title track has this sort of bittersweet tinge to it that I think is so well punctuated. And similarly to an album like Injury Reserves By the Time I Get to Phoenix, almost talking about sort of that cyclical nature that grief can have as far as relapsing into more intense grief, like on Nothing at All, which has the sort of rager that comes in at the perfect moment that this album doesn't have a whole lot of, but uses, again, so very well. I think that, again, if we're talking like modern rock albums, especially Foo Fighters albums, pacing-wise, consistency-wise, this is just a really great batch of songs. Would I argue that, unlike other records, this feels more like an album experience than any other Foo Fighters album? Absolutely. But does that let any of its strengths not stand out on their own? Absolutely not. The opener, Rescued, is a great mission statement track that starts this record off on a powerful fucking foot. I think sort of the haunting ideas within Hearing Voices lyrically is accented by the focus on more of an acoustic-driven soundscape. I'd say the same is sort of felt on the final track, Rest, which kind of comes in to the forefront after such a long stretch like The Teacher, perfectly so. While I like its particular brand of guitar styling on Show Me How, I think that following up that with Beyond Me is a track that I don't think is as strong. And even in that instance, some of the tracks that I don't like nearly as much, like Beyond Me, don't feel as detractory as negatives on your typical Foo Fighters album. I don't know. This is a strong-ass prospect by these guys, and I think as far as, like, rock-ass rock albums go from this year, this is easily far and above one of the best ones I've personally heard, and I'm giving this an 8 out of 10. I think that if you enjoy bands using music as therapy and turning something else out of it amidst that, But Here We Are is a good textbook example of a band in their lane doing it very well.
I know you try hard, but they know better.
One of my favorite things about Janelle Monae is her ability to sort of juggle these ideas of higher concept world building and album construction and some of the lyrical ideas, along with using those world building ideas to create the sort of subversion of some ideas, a la what she did on like Dirty Computer, while also being so sneakily and cheekily horny sprinkled throughout the projects. And with the release of her newest album, The Age of Pleasure, she seemingly dissects herself from some of those ideas in lieu of just doubling down on being incredibly fucking horny and sensual. This album is very much the horniest I've ever seen Janelle Monae, But that's not necessarily a bad thing. I always love to see Janelle Monáe get empowered by her own horniness and use her sexiness as sort of a stance, as sort of a power move in herself creatively speaking. I think that the strengths that lie in those other albums as far as like sequencing is considered and album construction isn't lost by stripping away some of those bigger concepts, because I mean the big concept is being lavish and having sex and being sensual about it. Everything flows so beautifully together. I would argue it's a little more focalized genre-wise. A lot of the tracks really sort of sit in this same sort of laid-back summer realm. This is very much a summer-ass summer record. And that's not to its detriment. I feel like there are some things that I don't like about the album as a whole as far as some of its pacing is considered, but the one thing I can't knock is that it does just sound really well done as a whole piece. It already sits shorter than all of her other records, so I kind of like that it does just kind of have this nice sort of flow through it. It feels that sort of aquatic imagery that the album art evokes very much feels like the sonic palette with which Janelle was working with creatively on this. My biggest problem with this is that in spite of all of these tracks flowing so very well together, there's a handful of instances where these tracks just feel really, really short and feel like glorified interlude fodder. While they are used to sort of extend the ideas from the meteor tracks like Champagne Shit and Phenomenal, like in the vein of Black Sugar Beach and Hot, I almost feel like some collaborations feel so underutilized. Like Grace Jones on Ooh La La. You could have done so much with her. Creatively speaking, the two of them together sound like a recipe for success. But Ooh La La is just kind of a nothing interlude. It adds to the sort of spacious atmosphere, but given the caliber of these two and the themes of the record, I feel like more could have been done there. Same with the French 75. There's this atmosphere to it that feels very in line with the newest IDK project, as far as like fitting into the album's pocket nicely and having a nice addition to the overall atmosphere, but nothing really happens of it. I enjoy when this album is delivering some full-fledged jams, though. I already mentioned some of the tracks in the front half that I enjoy, but also Waterslide, one of the newest singles, just really lends to that aquatic atmosphere so beautifully. That horn sample that lies underneath No Better sort of cuts through the aquatic mix so very well. That laid-back reggae jam atmosphere on Only Have Eyes for Two and A Dry Red, the closer. Send the album off into the sunset very beautifully. There's a lot to this record that I can appreciate. Unlike every other Janelle Monáe record, though, it's left me wanting a decent amount more. For somebody who does a good job at being horny and sensual in so many different ways, to make an album that is all about that, I feel like could have had so much more in the pot. What's here is really good, but it does, for the first time, feel like a Janelle Monáe project that is just a little bit undercooked. I'm giving it a 7 out of 10 because I love the lush production. I like the collaborations on here when they are used well. I think the elegance is still felt on here, and you can tell that this feels like the sort of Roman pleasure pit. I just kind of wish it went farther in that pleasure. You know what I mean? I have been waiting for this record for years. Expect a reflecting on I remembered but then I forgot sometime this fall. But Jean Lajoie's sincere-esque folk adjacent project Wolfie's Just Fine felt like a canon event for me, to put a recent term that's been floating in the zeitgeist into a review. I really appreciated John's ability to write songs that both felt like pocket character pieces in tandem with injecting his own sincere look at what is sometimes a comically looking scenario, like The New Beginning from the last album, and that crops up again on here. But here we are, 7 years later, finally with a follow-up, Everyone's Dead Except Us. A project that I would argue gives us more of that, but also less in the same breath. This project is a little bit shorter than I remember, than I forgot, but I would argue the hit ratio on here is still pretty fucking choice. And the points where he sort of expands on his own proverbial creative energy, I think sticks the landing pretty well. I think that the sort of foreboding optimism in the opening track sets a good precedent, and I think following that up with Mortal Kombat 2, a track that feels very in line with stuff from the first album, and writing this big, grand, sweeping, emotionally driven track that at its core is just about being better than your older siblings at video games, is very on brand for this project. While also finding ways to be a little more internal with his current self, it feels like on Good Enough, a track that talks about having these sort of skill sets and your own aspirations, but being held back by your own self-doubt, with a groove that again sort of expands his own proverbial sonic palette. A sentiment that also comes back on the track Hulk Hogan Slammed Andre the Giant. Again, a big, sweeping, emotional gravitas jam about the first time you saw Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant fight in a wrestling match on TV. Very on brand for this, and while I'm not a wrestling guy, I can get into that sort of hype, while also finding ways to sort of look insularly, both sincerely in a current sense and in a reflective sense, like on Good Enough or Staying with the Bomb, two tracks that kind of feel like John deconstructing his own shortcomings in some senses. Good Enough being about knowing that you are a talented or driven individual, you just sometimes don't have the motivation, or your own self-doubts get in the way. Or Staying with the Bomb sort of reflecting on one's own end, which sort of feels like a planting moment for Nothing Goes Away and When You Go, which talk more about loss and moving on. Song for Dad is a really sincere moment that definitely encapsulates some of those themes as well. And unlike I Remember Then I Forgot, there's some tracks I like less than others, but given this album's runtime, those moments that I don't like sort of stand above a bit more, tracks that I think are a little more milquetoast and underwhelming, or tracks that I think are just kind of normal and don't really have that much going on in the grand scheme, like Get Away and St. Paul. Two tracks that are fine, they just definitely feel like filler fodder, and on a track so short, filler fodder definitely hits a little bit harder to me. But I still like a lot of this. I think that the production palette still suits John's voice, his guitar style, and the additions that he's made to his accompaniment in the form of like more groovier pockets or some different accompaniment. The production helps suit that tenfold. His vocal layering is still fucking choice as well. I love when he really hits those belting notes, and on this, it definitely shines as well. I really enjoyed this, and while I don't think I like it as much I Remember Then I Forgot, I'm gonna give this the same score that I gave That Then, because I would definitely rate I Remember Then I Forgot infinitely higher than I gave it back in 2016. I'm giving this an 8. I was sitting with it at a lower score, but I really like this album's highs, and I think that as far as expanding on and fortifying the foundations that were laid on the last project, this does do so pretty damn well in my opinion. Queens of the Stone Age are back with the end of a trilogy with In Times New Roman, a record that sees them trying to bridge the gap between the darkness scene on Like Clockwork and some of those groovier tendencies found on Villains, and make a project that, while sonically kind of bridging that gap, lyrically feels all the more dissected from those two projects. Sure, it delves into some of the elements explored as far as like feeling an isolation or indifference to the world at large, like on What the People Say, or looking at one's own interrelationship struggles in the form of Negative Space and Emotion Sickness, which talk more about Josh Homme's sort of dissolvement from his ex-wife and how the relationship sort of fizzled into the horizons, where tracks like Obsceniary and Straitjacket Fitting, which bookend the project, more widen that scope to the world at large. I just don't think a lot of these ideas fit together in the same sort of brilliant cocktail that the last two albums did, in my opinion. I appreciate stuff like the strings that come in on the opener and closer, but I do wish they were done more. I dig the more straightforward, close to rager sounds on tracks like What the People Say and Negative Space. Even if, again, I really don't fuck with the posturing on Negative Space, given where Josh Homme's kind of gone post-Villains. I will give Emotion Sickness this. It at least utilizes its idea and lyrical palette in the sort of turn of phrase of Emotion Sickness a lot better, in my opinion, to create a very quintessential sounding Queen's-ass groove. I'll give them this as well. The runtime of the last track and how it evolves across its almost 9-minute length is pretty amicably done. And that groove still does get really nice in the pocket on Time and Place and Sicily. But again, even those tracks, for as solid as they feel, as far as an album experience, they feel loosely abstract from them. I don't know, this feels less like a cohesive third piece of a puzzle and more like a handful of ideas that could loosely fit a trilogy trying to be mashed together. There's a handful of tracks that I'll walk away from this enjoying, and I like some of the lyrical turns of phrase that crop up on some of the tracks that I mentioned, like Sicily and Paper Machete and Carnivore. But even some of those tracks, like Carnivore, I feel like by the end of its building groove, it doesn't have the climax that I would hope for with a track that takes its time like that. I don't know, I'll admit, I was a little disappointed with In Times New Roman. I don't think there's nearly as many songs that are strong as the last two parts of this trilogy, if I'm looking at it like that. And you can tell they're trying to bridge those worlds in a way that sort of feels akin to Queens of the Stone Age's past, a la like a Lullabies to Paralyze. But even that record, I don't necessarily like quite as much as the rest of their catalog. And while this is definitely a bit lighter than that as far as its length is considered, I don't think that trimming the fat in that sort of sense led to a stronger prospect. It made it feel all the more directionless. I don't think it's the worst record that they've released, but it's definitely the one that every time I've walked away from it, I've just felt the same emptiness that I wouldn't say that I felt leaving it, especially their last couple of records, which I would argue are some of their strongest. There's just a little spice that I think is missing in aspects of this that wasn't missing on those last two. I'm still landing with this on like a 7 out of 10. It's got strengths for sure, but even the band themselves doesn't utilize some of those strengths in sequence, as I feel like they did the pieces on the albums leading up to this.
I actually took a $300 Uber to a show and sleep in the back like Future might as well be a Maybach.
I think it's safe to say at this point that I'm a Billy Woods fan, even if I'll still miss releases that he drops, because he's a pretty fucking prolific rapper. He hasn't dropped a project that I haven't at least loved. And this newest project, Maps, a collaboration with Kenny Segal, is another fucking smash in my opinion. While the album art evokes travel and exploration, Billy's lyrical tapestry complements that full stop by having these both great turns of phrase in the title of each track being focused on throughout the track itself with some of its reference play, like on Rapper Weed or on the opener Kenwood Speakers, creating a track called Houdini, which is about escaping reality similarly to how Houdini would do his escape tricks with magic, but with weed, is a really good metaphor. The loss of communication with others around you while on your travels and FaceTime is a really good sort of expression shared throughout that track. It's just a really smartly written project, which I would expect nothing less from Billy Woods at this point, and his rhyme spinning on here is superb. And I like how across this whole project of traveling and basking and being high on weed with these dense bars, thematically, sonically, the production palette accents that whimsy, similarly to what Tyler did on Call Me If You Get Lost, but with that same abstractness that Billy Woods just excels in as a rapper. And the guests on here do nothing but accent that 10 fucking fold. I love Danny on Year Zero and the sort of illusions that Year Zero, the downward spiral, these darker Nine Inch Nails references in these rap track collaborations doesn't feel like an oversight. Everything here feels purposeful in the best way possible. As somebody who's also gotten into Arm & Hammer over the last couple years, I love When You Listen does crop in on Baby Steps and the closer As the Crow Flies. I love Aesop Rock on Waiting Around, and I think that he suits that beat so incredibly well. Quell Chris, as well as sort of a standard staple for running in with these crowds, I think delivers a really good feature as well. This is just textbook excellent hip-hop from a rapper that does so eloquently well. Even as the travels sort of revolve around back home, and on New York City Tap Water, especially in the second verse, he goes on a 6B panorama tip and talks about some time being high at home and hearing the sounds around him. He does a good job at putting the listener in his POV, as he's done so well in the past, in my opinion. I love this project. Easily one of the best rap albums I've heard all year. I love the instrumental palette. I love the bars, and it's everything I like about hip-hop. I'm giving this a 9 out of 10, man.
That awaits inside the wedge, sharpening its
I try to cover as many of the King Gizzard projects that drop amidst the multitude of ones that they still drop because they are easily one of the hardest working, most prolific bands in music right now. Couples sometimes slip through the cracks, but when I heard that they were returning back to thrash on PetroDragonic Apocalypse or Dawn of Eternal Night and Annihilation of Planet Earth and the... what is the full title for this fucking album? PetroDragonic Apocalypse or Dawn of Eternal Night and Annihilation of Planet Earth and the beginning of Merciless Damnation, I was excited. Infest the Rat's Nest is one of their best records in my opinion. I think that them leaning into thrash super heavily paid off wondrously for them, and I think that the doubling down on the environmental driven message from that record on this was a really smart move as well. But it also doubles as this concept record of what feels like these witches trying to save the world and its apocalypse by summoning a giant monster to just act as a giant reset button. Which lyrically, I think the album does a good job at sticking to those thematics. I think that the imagery of apocalypse is definitely showcased full stop on tracks like Converge and Supercell, which Supercell is also supposed to be this commentary on the overconsumption of oil and how it is really ruining the planet. I think that the monstrous tones that come in on Gila Monster, the track in question where the monster ravages the world, feels monumental and huge. Gargantuan, in fact, and the music accompanies that with its heavy riffage. My biggest detractor with this project is ultimately kind of the production. I think it kneecaps a lot of those thrash ideals in the way that Infest the Rat's Nest did not. And I feel like if they were to lean into this production style, they should have switched up their accompaniment, or at least their song arranging style, to suit that, because the dense guitars don't sound as good in this because the drums have this sound to them that I feel like almost kneecaps the guitars. I feel like this album would have suited more with like a Slayer style twin guitar setup for a lot of it, especially given some of the solo work and riffs that are throughout this thing. The solo work on Gila Monster in particular just feels incredibly neutered in the mix. The same could be said for the closer Flamethrower, which I'm going to use as sort of a moment to pivot into talking about that. The point that, while I like that King Gizzard have transitioned into this sort of jam band era that they've been, I would argue, sort of doing some really cool creative stuff with, thrash bands that do write long songs don't write long songs like what King Gizzard are doing on here, and I feel like it pulls me out of the thrash element when tracks like Dragon and the opener Motor Spirit sort of continue along and move across these different movements. It feels a lot more jammy than it does thrashy, and it definitely takes me out of the experience at least a little bit. I still like this project, and I think as far as creating like a concise narrative on a project, they've done worse. I just think that sonically they've done a better job at tapping into an adjacent sound better. I'm gonna give this a 6. You know, for as much as I really liked the lyrical concept, and I think that the band plays to that strength incredibly well, the production in tandem with some of the longer songs feeling a bit more jammy than thrashy, and again, that production sort of kneecapping some of those thrash ideals just kind of sets this back to me. And a similar way to like Fishing for Fishes did. I liked Fishing for Fishes, and it's a project that I would feel, I argue, kind of growed on me a little bit more as time has gone on. I'd much rather listen to Infest the Rat's Nest over this album any day.
How could I be a father? Damn it, keep getting harder. Have mercy, every week something hitting me adverse.
When Mike dropped Run last year, I was curious to see if he was actually going to be working on a solo album, because him and Elle haven't done a solo project since starting Run the Jewels. And while Run the Jewels wasn't my entry point into Mike's music, I was really curious to see what a project of his post Elle's impact on his artistic growth would sound like. And on Michael, we see Mike sort of widening the scope of what he's talked about in bursts of the Run the Jewels catalog, and sort of further accenting those points that he did bring out of Elle, but also just showing his own portrait. The sonic palette of this feels more in line with Southern hip-hop. You know, he samples more blues and soul on here. That horn flip on Run is fucking choice. the choir vocals that come in, the layered vocals that come in on Scientists and Engineers has this soulful edge to it that when the synths come in throughout Andre 3000's verse create this great moment. That same power and soulfulness is felt on a track like Shed Tears as chorus, which just hits you like a semi on the freeway. And lyrically, I like that an uncompromised Mike is one that still feels very in line with his own politics that he has continued to flourish out with. Again, post Run the Jewels is more monolithic status, because I feel like Run the Jewels has definitely gotten bigger than both Mike and L had ever gotten in their respective careers. And I like that he's taking that point to, on his own, further address his own politics in a way that I think is done pretty well on a lot of this. I really enjoyed Run. I think that the censoring of it on the album version is incredibly strange, especially given that, like, Mike's not one to not liberally use the N-word, especially on this project. It's done so to speak on the struggles that he's seen and has faced in his own life. And I think that that's a weird artistic choice personally. I mean, there's a track on here called Enrich, which is supposed to talk about sort of the transcendence of black people amidst those stereotypes and having their own lavish parts of life, you know? Doesn't see Mike painting himself out into a corner that he's not in, because he talks about sort of the places he's been post, again, that prominence and success. But I like that he keeps it straight on how he feels amidst that success and how he still feels marginalized. He still feels sort of dissected from some of his white peers and from the government that he's been a lot more intimately involved with. And I think that as far as keeping with Mike's mission statement as an artist, Michael does a good job at reaffirming that while having some really good fucking tracks in the mix. Outside of Run, I think that Scientists and Engineers is an insanely good track where an incredible use of Andre 3000 comes back into fray. And I really hope that, like in the 2010s, we see more random Andre 3000 just glossing up a project in his own splendorous fashion. I think the storytelling on Slumber is really well done, and that sort of soulful beat just sounds really good underneath Mike. I think the same could be said for Exit 9 as well. I think the storytelling on that is aces. Obviously, while I liked Andre's feature, I am glad to see L crop up on Don't Let the Devil. And obviously that chemistry is still tenfold on that track because Mike comes in hot from jump on there. I'm not gonna lie, I also really like seeing a dude like Currency get to come into the fray on a Killer Mike project, because I would argue, while Currency is mostly known for weed rap, it's cool to see him be on a project that is far more than just your typical weed rap project. And I think putting him on the track with 2 Chainz to let the two of them stand above in their own ways, I think is a smart choice. And I like that amidst all of that, speaking of one's own personal problems with the storytelling done on here, he also gets really touching in moments, like on Motherless. I just honestly wish this project had a little more consistency in that production, because there's some pockets on here where I feel like the production doesn't hit as hard as others, or some of the ideas that sort of crop up throughout the project are used a lot less successfully, like on 2 Days, the track with Ty Dolla $ign. It's a decent banger, but as far as the production is considered, I don't think it's as good, or doesn't hit as heavy as other parts of the project. For all that I like about Spaceship Views for what it does, I also think that that's another aspect. I think that's another beat that isn't quite as good, especially if you're evoking, you know, Currency era vibes. Same for Something for the Junkies, a track that sort of talks about music as a vice, or giving people a track that's just hard-hitting in the sword. The beat is a little lackluster for me, but that being said, Michael is still a pretty damn solid project from Killer Mike, and I think as far as delivering a solo outing post what I would argue is one of the more fruitful, prolific aspects of an artist's career, he could have done far fucking worse. But it shows that Mike is still great on his own. I'm going to be giving this a 7 out of 10. I did want a little bit more out of it, but I think when Mike shines, he does so brilliantly on here. And that was everything I spun this month. Did you like these albums? Were there some that I've missed so far this year that you think I should check out? Leave those thoughts and suggestions in the comments down below. If you did like this video, give it a like. If you want to see more, consider subscribing. I drop 2 to 4 vids a week, depending on what I've got going on. I'm going to go, though. Thank you again so very much for watching. I've been Viral Rack. You guys have a good day's lives and situations, and I'll see you another day.